Hello, and welcome to this Heroes of Blackreach tutorial. In this tutorial, I will be looking at how to use psychic powers. In the Warhammer 40k universe, there exists something called the Warp. The Warp is an alternate dimension which consists of psychic energy. Individuals that can tap into this psychic energy are called Psykers. In Heroes of Blackreach, both the Orcs and the Ultramarines can include a Psyker in their army. For the Orcs, the Psyker is called a Weirdboy, and for the Ultramarines, their Psykers are Librarians. So here we can see the recruitment tiles for a Weirdboy and a Librarian. The recruitment tiles have slots where you can place different types of psychic powers. So in this case, the Weirdboy is bringing along Killbolt and Warpath, and the Librarian is bringing along Endurance and Enfeeble. So let's have a look in more detail at the Killbolt psychic power. So each psychic power recruitment option has a name. It also has a section below the name that summarizes the psychic power in terms of symbols. In the bottom left corner, you have the cost of the psychic power in terms of army points. Finally, in the bottom right-hand corner, you have the cost to manifest the psychic power. In other words, the cost to actually activate that psychic power, and that cost is always measured in suppressed markers. So here we see the Weirdboy, and he's going to be manifesting that Killbolt psychic power. So the first step is to pay the cost of the psychic power. So in this case, he takes a single suppressed marker. Next comes the perils of the warp test. So for that, he needs to add together his psychic ability, which in this case is a level 2. Next, the Orc player needs to roll a die. So here he's rolled a 5, so that gives us a total of 7. But then we have to subtract 2 points for every suppressed marker that is sitting on the Weirdboy unit. In this case, that's 1 suppressed marker. So the result of this Perils of the Warp test would be a score of 5. So let's have a look now at what happens depending on the results of that Perils of the Warp test. So if the Weirdboy were to have scored a 1 or fewer, then the psychic power would not happen. It would have no effect. The Weirdboy is actually completely destroyed, and he will do damage to units that are adjacent to him. So here we can see the Weirdboy on the battle grid, and let's assume that he's surrounded by these other units. So remember, if his result of his Perils of the Warp test is a 1 or fewer, then he is destroyed. The empty square where the Weirdboy was previously has an interspace at each of the 4 corners. So in order to work out which of these adjacent units gets damaged by the exploding Weirdboy, place the blast template on one of the 4 interspaces such that it overlaps the largest number of units. So for this configuration, the interspace will be this one. So we place the blast template over those 3 units, and we use the combat values for the B template. So rather unfortunately for the Orcs, in this case, as the Weirdboy's head explodes, that damage spreads out and hits those 3 slugger units, leaving that unit of tactical marines completely unscathed. So now we understand how to deal with 1 or fewer, let's move on to the next result. If the score had been a 2 or a 3, then he still gets to apply the effects of the psychic power, so he'd still get to use the Killbolt psychic power. However, he would take a hit, which means his token would be flipped over, but he would also discard any of the suppressed markers that were on his unit token. Finally, if the score had been a 4 or more, then he would just apply the effects of the psychic power normally with no penalties. So let's have a look now at how the psychic power is manifested and how we apply the effects of that psychic power. Here we have the Weirdboy at the bottom of the battle grid, and we'll add some extra units to illustrate this example. So let's look at some of the symbols on the Killbolt psychic power so we can understand how it works. This lightning bolt symbol means that this is a beam power, and I'll show what that means in more detail in a moment. The next symbol tells us that this psychic power has a range of 6 squares. For this psychic power, we can target any square within 6 squares. And for this example, I've picked this square marked with the red X. So just a reminder that we need to pay the cost whenever we manifest the psychic power. So I've added the suppressed marker to the Weirdboy. If you have to add more than one suppressed marker to the Weirdboy, then you have the option of putting the second suppressed marker on an orc that's within 2 squares of the Weirdboy. However, in this case, the psychic power simply costs 1 suppressed marker, so that goes on to the Weirdboy directly. Next, we do the perils of the warp test, which we've already discussed, so let's assume that was successful and we got a 4 or more. So at that point then, the Weirdboy fires the kill bolt across the battlefield at the target square. Let's talk a little bit about this beam weapon. So a beam weapon goes from the center of the Weirdboy's tile to the center of the target square. The beam ignores all obstacles along its path, so that includes both terrain elements and units. And all units, friend or foe, along the line are affected by the psychic power. Finally, you'll notice that the Weirdboy is hiding behind those rocks. He doesn't have line of sight to those ultramarine units, but that doesn't matter for a beam weapon. He will still hit those units regardless. Each target that's been hit by the beam needs to be resolved individually. So each attack is treated like a firing action using the combat values that are on the Killbolt psychic power. So let's return now to these 2 recruitment tiles. We're going to look this time though at the Librarian, and we're going to see the steps involved for him to manifest the Enfeeble psychic power. So here we see the Librarian, Servius, and the Enfeeble psychic power tile. So just like for the Weirdboy, before the Librarian can use the Enfeeble psychic power, he has to pay the cost in terms of suppressed markers. We start by adding 2 suppressed markers to the Librarian tile. Next, we need to do a Perils of the Warp test. So just like the Weirdboy, we have to add the psychic power of the Librarian, which in this case is 2, to the result of a die roll. And then finally, we subtract 2 points for every suppressed marker that is on the Librarian tile. So in this case, the Librarian would have a result of 3 for his Perils of the Warp test. For a Librarian though, he only fails a Perils of the Warp test on a result of 1 or fewer. If a Librarian fails his Perils of the Warp test, then he needs to draw one of these Perils of the Warp markers at random. Let's go through each one in turn and see what it means. So if he draws the first marker, then the psychic power has no effect. He doesn't continue to manifest the psychic power. He then has to completely discard the psychic power option from his recruitment tile, and he's unable to use that psychic power for the rest of the game. And then finally, he discards any suppressed markers that are on his tile. If the second marker is drawn, then you get to apply the effects of the psychic power. However, the Librarian will suffer 1 hit, which means you'll have to flip over the Librarian's tile, but you do get to discard suppressed markers that are on the tile. For the third and fourth markers, again you get to apply the effects of the psychic power, but you have to add either 1 or 2 extra suppressed markers onto the Librarian's tile. For the final marker, you again get to apply the effects of the psychic power. You also get to discard any suppressed markers that are on the Librarian's tile, and you get to reuse the same psychic power again, although you will have to pay the cost of the psychic power to do that and go through another Perils of the Warp test. It's important to note that whenever you get a Perils of the Warp test for a Librarian, you are always picking from these 5 Perils of the Warp markers. You don't discard them or anything like that. Now let's look at what would happen if the Librarian was able to manifest that psychic power. So again, we'll have another example. So here we have a battle grid with the Librarian and 2 Orc units. So remember, we're trying to cast Enfeeble. So let's go through what some of the symbols mean on the psychic power. This red triangle symbol means that you must have clear or obscured line of sight to your target. Some psychic powers also have a green triangle symbol, and that means you must have a clear line of sight, so the line of sight cannot be obscured in that case. But here we have the red one. With this configuration, the Librarian does not have line of sight to that Orc unit in the bottom left-hand corner, so he cannot manifest the psychic power against that unit. However, he has a clear line of sight to that unit in the top corner, so he's going to try and manifest the psychic power against that unit. The psychic power also has a limited range, so he can only target a unit that's within 6 squares. So that Slugger's unit in the top corner is within 6 squares. So just another reminder that before you were to manifest the psychic power, you have to pay. So he pays with those 2 suppressed markers that go onto the Librarian's tile. You then do the Perils of the Warp test, which we've been through. So assuming that passed, he then gets to target that Slugger's unit in the top corner. The Librarian then places the Enfeeble marker onto that unit of Sluggers. And so long as that unit has that marker on it, then it will suffer a -2 penalty to all of its die rolls. The Librarian has a special ability. He can focus to discard a suppressed marker. So at the beginning of the supply phase, if the Librarian was not activated this game turn, you can remove 1 suppressed marker instead of taking a movement action in the supply phase. You get to take the suppressed marker in addition to the suppressed marker that you normally remove in the supply phase. The Enfeeble psychic power has a marker associated with it. Any psychic power that has a marker associated with it is a persistent psychic power. A Librarian or a Weirdboy that's managed to manifest a persistent psychic power can choose to maintain that persistent power into the next turn. At the beginning of the order phase, each Psyker in initiative order can choose to maintain the psychic power that they already have manifested. To maintain the psychic power, simply place the number of suppressed markers equal to the cost of the psychic power onto either Librarian or the Weirdboy in order to leave the marker on the target unit. When maintaining a psychic power, you don't need to do a Perils of the Warp test. If you choose not to maintain a psychic power, then just discard the marker at the start of the order phase. If that power is manifested against a different target, then reuse that same marker. If at any point the Psyker is destroyed, then remove any persistent psychic power markers that are currently in effect. There are lots of different psychic powers in the game, and even more if you have the expansions, and there are too many really to go through in this tutorial. So what I've tried to do is just give you a flavour of how the psychic powers work, and how to perform Perils of the Warp tests for both Librarians and for Weirdboys. And I'll leave you to discover the fun you can have manifesting some of these psychic powers on the battlefield. So that's all for this tutorial. If you've not played the game before, or if you're new to the game, then do subscribe because I'll be doing more of these tutorials in the future. Also, if you want to watch the game in action, then don't forget to watch some of the scenario playthroughs that I've put together. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.